HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Man They Wanted Me to Be, Toxic Masculinity and a Crisis of Our Own Making, by Yates Sexton, read by Yates Sexton. This book is dedicated to my mother, Patty Ann McKee, for all that we went through and for never giving up. We do a great disservice to boys in how we raise them. We stifle the humanity of boys. We define masculinity in a very narrow way. Masculinity is a hard, small cage, and we put boys inside this cage. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, we should all be feminists. Prologue. During the 2 years I reported from the 2016 campaign trail, I watched stump speeches in cramped union halls and polished addresses to thousands, survived the major conventions, dodged flashbangs, and retreated from burning limos at an inaugural riot, and generally dove headfirst into one of the most bizarre and contentious political contests in American history. The majority of this time, however, was devoted to studying the phenomenon that was the Donald Trump campaign, a rolling disaster equal parts professional wrestling and pure rage. After sneaking into his rallies, speaking with his supporters, and examining that mess from every conceivable angle, what I eventually found at the dark heart of it all was white men. At the rallies, they'd crowd into a scrum in front of the stage and stand shoulder to shoulder. On their way in, they'd buy buttons calling Hillary Clinton a bitch, or else they'd choose between two of the most popular shirts for sale. Hillary sucks, but not like Monica. Or one with Trump riding a motorcycle that Clinton had just been thrown from and wearing a vest that said, "If you can read this, the bitch fell off." In the comfort of the crowd, they used disgusting language and trafficked in casual racism, virulent misogyny, and undisguised homophobia. At times, they seemed spurred on by each other, as if in competition to see who could step furthest over the line of common decency. I was able to be one of the first journalists to walk among them because these are my people. Growing up in a dirt-poor factory family in southern Indiana, I'd heard all of this before, though usually behind closed doors, and thus could observe without flinching or revealing myself. I also knew how to dress: jeans, t-shirts, scuffed boots, and old soiled baseball cap, and to carry myself as if I had better things to do and yet was ready to fight at a moment's notice. I could blend in because I'd been doing so for years, faking it with my own family. The things those men said I'd heard at barbecues and holidays. The same groups they were angry with were the ones they'd railed about for as long as I could remember. These men raised me. They punished me when I didn't fit in. They beat me and tortured me, all in an effort to toughen me up and make me just like them. They were my uncles, my cousins, my friends, my neighbors, my stepfathers, and even my own father. There in the crowd, I looked and performed like them, but I still felt as strange and as odd as I did back home. From the time I was very little, I'd always been like a stranger among my family. I watched them and took my cues, but I could never escape the suspicion that in some way, shape, or form, I was unusual. That fact didn't go unnoticed by the men in my world. To my relatives, I was different, a word I'd heard them use in a suspicious voice whenever they thought I was out of earshot. They were uncomfortable around me, thrown off by how I spoke and how often I'd ask questions that required more than a monosyllabic yes or no, or one of their customary grunts or groans women had learned to translate out of necessity. I talked about feelings, read books, and when I played with my toys, even the action figures and robots that all came with missiles and machine guns, they spent more time communicating than battling each other. The patriarchal structure my family operated under was described by the women as the way it's always been, a tired nod to a way of life that had been rooted in place since before they were born. It meant that women tended to the home, even as they worked jobs to make ends meet, and then raised their children. The man was expectantly beleaguered by his backbreaking job, and having given his all to the factory, mine, or body shop, he had no more energy to spare for his partner or his family, no more strength for functioning besides maybe taking out the trash or mowing the yard on the weekend. Men were effectively the kings of their household, the final word on every matter above reproach or question. They were to be feared and taken care of. They sat in front of a game on the TV like a royal contemplating stately matters upon a throne. And like many kings, they possessed a great ability to be cruel. When their power or sovereignty was questioned, their response was anger. They yelled, they threw things, they were violent, and these outbursts always coincided with lapses in authority, humiliations at work, and any number of breaches of that sovereignty. Like kings, they were also benefactors of privilege they had earned by simply being born. And when those privileges were tested, whether these were my relatives or the men like those at Trump's rallies, they declared war. When I think about masculinity, and particularly my struggle to find my place in the masculine world, the man who comes to mind most is my father. Of course, father issues are nothing new. Art is littered with books and songs and plays and movies about it. But when I look at my relationship with John Robert Sexton, those difficulties mostly center on what is expected out of a man. Like the others, Dad knew I was different. 5 years after he died, I sat down to talk with my stepmother, Nancy, and the word she used to describe his feelings about me as a child was soft, a catch-all that meant sensitive, vulnerable, artistic. Following a traumatic and abusive divorce, my parents were estranged, and I spent the overwhelming majority of my time with my mom. I saw Dad on holidays and the occasional vacation, but I got a sense I made him uneasy, and over time, that he was happier when our time together was sparse. When I did see him, though, I was terrified of his macho act. He bragged incessantly about his time in the Marines and preferred to be outside drinking beer and working with his hands. In his absence, the family told stories about his legendary days raising hell. He had no time for my bullshit, and when we talked, which wasn't often, he was dismissive, sexist, racist, and closed off. Back then, my dad would have been the exact type of man you'd expect to vote for Donald Trump. When talk with his buddies turned to outsiders, be they immigrants, homosexuals, feminists, or the few African Americans or Mexicans who dared to move into our small Indiana town, things turned ugly. Like the conversations I'd heard in and outside Trump rallies, it was our town, our country. There was no doubt white men ruled the world and everyone else was looking to steal it away. The older I got, and the more the distance between my dad and me started to hurt, I tried to play the role he expected. I'd go fishing, camping, bowling. I would stand there as he and the other men talked. Much like Donald Trump's infamous locker room session where he bragged that he could grab women by the pussy, men unencumbered by the presence of women often break their self-imposed vow of silence, and what they say more often than not is beyond offensive. I've heard men joke about wanting to rape women. I've heard men describe their sexual encounters in stark, humiliating detail. I've heard men use every slur, racial or otherwise, you could ever imagine. I've heard men express their most fundamentally racist and sexist beliefs, have heard them lust after authoritarian power, say they'd be just fine eliminating all minorities, that they wish every man, woman, and child in the Middle East would be incinerated with nuclear bombs, have heard them discuss the merits of reinstituting slavery, and go several rounds of admiring Adolf Hitler. For those men, communication is either a utility to get something done or another opportunity to further the illusion that they are unburdened by consciences or weak emotions. My dad was like that for the majority of the 30 years I knew him. At nearly every occasion, he was either stoic or aggressively politically incorrect, and the worldview he presented was as cold and cruel as he would like to have been perceived. But then something happened. He changed, wholesale. When I look back on it, I wonder if it was because he knew he was running out of time. Unchecked diabetes. Like many men, Dad refused to tell anyone he was sick and then avoided seeing a doctor for fear of appearing weak, took his life at the early age of 59. But before it did, Dad spent the last decade of his life as a different man. This came after we finally got to know each other and grew into friends. I was older, and a few rough years had worn away some of the softness he despised in me. We met somewhere in the middle, me turning into a harder, stoic man, and my father finally emerging from his shell. In these years, we did the tried and true masculine things. We watched ball games on the TV, fished for catfish and bluegill in stripper pits in the Green Sullivan State Forest, shot guns, stood out in the garage, as is customary, and generally bullshitted. But what was most amazing, other than my father's apparent transformation, was that Dad, seemingly exhausted by years of near silence, began to speak openly about the burden of masculinity. He told me the expectations he'd carried as a father, as a son, as a man, had sabotaged his relationships and prevented him from expressing himself or really enjoying intimacy emotionally or intellectually his entire life. Shocked at the depth of frustration and despair my dad had suffered, I listened and realized for the first time that the masculinity I'd sought, the masculinity I'd been denied, had always been an impossibility. Deep down, I realized that masculinity as I knew it, as it was presented to me, was a lie. Men like my father, and men like him who attend Trump rallies, join misogynistic subcultures, populate some of the most hateful groups in the world, and are prisoners of toxic masculinity, an artificial construct whose expectancies are unattainable, thus making them exceedingly fragile and injurious to others, not to mention themselves. The illusion convinces them from an early age that men deserve to be privileged and entitled, that women and men who don't conform to traditional standards are second-class persons, are weak and thus detestable. This creates a tyrannical, patriarchal system that tilts the world further in favor of men, and as a side effect accounts for a great deal of crimes, including harassment, physical and emotional abuse, rape, and even murder. These men, and the boys following in their footsteps, were socialized in childhood to exhibit the ideal masculine traits, including stoicism, aggressiveness, extreme self-confidence, and an unending competitiveness. Those who do not conform are punished by their fathers in the form of physical and emotional abuse, and then further socialized by the boys in their school and community who have been enduring their own abuse at home. If that isn't enough, our culture then reflects those expectations in its television shows, movies, music, and especially in advertising, where products like construction site quality trucks, power tools, beer, gender deodorant, and even yogurt promise to bestow masculinity for the right price. The masculinity that's being sold, that's being installed via systematic abuse, is fragile because, again, it is unattainable. Humans are not intended to suppress their emotions indefinitely, to always be confident and unflinching. Traditional masculinity, as we know it, is an unnatural state, and as a consequence, men are constantly at war with themselves and the world around them. This book is about all those things. It's about the lie of traditional masculinity, its origins, the damage it has inflicted on men, women, children, and ultimately the world. It's specifically about white patriarchal masculinity, an especially potent and toxic system of power and control that has subjugated women and minorities for generations via methodical and organized actions powered by misogyny and racism, a unique brand of maleness that held sway over the United States of America since before its founding. It's about the men I grew up surrounded by, my family, my stepfathers, and my neighbors who abused and harassed and stalked and murdered. It's about the societal, psychological, economic, and sociological consequences of a lie so pervasive and deep-rooted most people don't even know it's a lie. It's about the current political impasse we find ourselves in, where fragile white men with fragile manhoods have stalled social progress and propelled into the White House a tough-talking, thin-skinned vulgarian who embodies more than anyone else toxic American masculinity. It's about how political polarization commoditized those insecurities while also cauterizing male doubt, thus creating a marketplace and a culture where insecure and embattled men engross themselves in products, entertainment, and a fabricated reality where the lie remains intact. It's about labor and economics and a changing world where the jobs and societal forces that originally necessitated what has come to be known as the quintessential working-class American male have given way to a new era of progressivism that rewards communication, creativity, and education, all things that have been scorned in working-class families for generations. It's about men who cherish independence and fashion themselves self-made, while forces they either don't understand or aren't even aware of influence and shape them every single day of their lives. It's about how complicated and exhausting masculinity is, how ingrained and inescapable, how someone like myself, who was bullied and abused for his reluctance to conform, and even aware of and educated about the lie, found himself, later in life, reacting to crises by suddenly embodying the masculine traits he'd hated so much, essentially becoming the man he'd feared his entire life, and finding himself in a bed in Muncie, Indiana, with the barrel of a rifle in his mouth and a finger on the trigger. And it's about how, after that close call, I decided to try, as imperfect as I am, to understand the lie and the people it hurt in an effort to find another way to live. Part 1. A Hard, Small Cage. 1. On October 7th, 2016, I was celebrating my 35th birthday when news broke that the Washington Post had just published an 11-year-old video of Republican nominee Donald Trump telling Access Hollywood host Billy Bush about pursuing a married woman like a bitch and bragging that his status as a celebrity meant women let him do whatever he wanted, including grabbing them by the pussy. Reaction was swift. Prominent Republicans voiced their displeasure as pundits on cable news and the internet speculated that Trump would have to step away from the nomination. Though the billionaire had survived multiple scandals that would have buried any other politician, this seemed a step too far. This was also the day Hurricane Matthew hit the southeastern United States. A few hours after the Post story dropped, Matthew slammed my home in Statesboro, Georgia, and torrential rain and violent winds buffeted my house well into the dawn. With the power out, I was left with a cooler full of beer and a night of deliberating whether Trump would drop out that evening or wait until the next day. After a terrible, anxious sleep, I was woken up a little after 6 a.m. by a man at my door wearing a threadbare flannel and dry-rotted blue jeans. "You hire anyone to take care of the tree yet?" he asked, hooking his thumb toward my driveway, where a giant pine had toppled and just nearly missed destroying my car. I took his number and told him I'd get back to him, and after he left, I surveyed the damage in my yard and the neighborhood. Limbs and leaves littered the street. Other trees had been uprooted completely, their roots exposed and the holes left behind flooded with muddy water. Roofs everywhere were damaged, power lines sagged, cars flattened. After a lap, I came home to find my neighbor standing in my driveway and staring at the tree. A retired older man, he'd always been quiet. The only words I'd ever heard from him were his dogs' names when he'd call them back to his yard. Not taking his eyes off the fallen tree, he asked, "You got a chainsaw?" When I told him I didn't, he asked, "Why don't you have a chainsaw? You need one for stuff like this." I explained that I'd bought the house, my first one, in April and was still working on getting the essentials. Huh. Instantly, I recognized the sound as one my male relatives had made so many times before. And with that, he walked back across the street, putting an end to our first conversation. By the time he returned with chainsaw in tow, I was feeling an old guilt I hadn't entertained in years. I'd failed at being a man. My neighbor sawed into the trunk of the pine, and for a while it seemed like he'd made quick and easy work of it until the blade caught in the meat of the tree. He braced himself with his boot on the bark and pulled to no avail. Frustrated, he backed off, put his hands on his hips, and sighed. Not long after, other men who'd been surveying the damage joined us and grouped around my driveway the way men often do, in a half circle, their arms crossed or stuffed in their pockets, plenty of room between them. With each new arrival, they'd ask my neighbor what had happened, if he'd tried this, tried that, then they'd take a turn trying to free the blade. Inevitably, they'd turn to me and ask whether I had a chainsaw, and when I said no, almost to a person, they'd answer with their own judgmental, "Huh." Later, after the saw had been rescued and the crowd dispersed, the man who'd knocked on my door that morning returned with a small crew that cut up the tree and left a mess of limbs and logs to carry and roll out to the road. The manual labor felt good, and had gone a long way toward restoring my bruised ego. That is, until I'd finished and just taken off my gloves, and one of the men from the earlier crowd came rolling by on a tricked-out golf cart, the kind that are very popular in my neighborhood, and when I raised my hand to wave, I got in return a disapproving shake of the head. For the next 2 days, I went without power, meaning there was plenty of time to get lost in my thoughts and wonder how the fallout from the Access Hollywood tape was playing out. Every time I logged online, I expected to find that Trump had dropped out of the race. Surprisingly, or maybe in retrospect not so surprisingly, Trump showed little remorse and even less intention to bow out. He dismissed the conversation as locker room talk, a perfect description, honestly, as I'd heard just that kind of garbage in my years playing sports where I'd had to listen to teammates brag about their sexual conquest. Even though it was a very small thing, the chainsaw situation stuck with me, and all of my time not spent analyzing Trump's unfailing lack of shame was dedicated to replaying the scene. I could still hear the confusion in those men's voices, could still see the annoyance on their faces. I'd managed to leave my past life behind, a time I'd been different, unfamiliar, and uncomfortable with the customs of men. Starting when I was 19, I'd changed and began carrying myself differently, dressed myself similarly, worked some jobs that earned calluses, and supplemented the knowledge I was supposed to have learned when I was younger. With the new house, I'd renovated portions of it, taught myself how through research and trial and error. To people who didn't know me before then, I appeared, for all intents and purposes, to be a pretty standard working-class Midwestern man. The incident with the saw reminded me of my shortcomings and got me thinking about my life in the culture in which someone like Donald Trump, a boisterous man's man who'd said he'd wanted protesters punched in the face, could survive a scandal like the release of the Access Hollywood tape. I jotted down some notes and began to see a pattern that seemed to be passing unnoticed in the conversation about just what the hell was going on. I pitched my editor at the New York Times and wrote the first paragraph to an op-ed titled Donald Trump's Toxic Masculinity. My editorial hit a nerve as my inbox filled up with emails from men and women alike. Some of the men were angry and called me a faggot and questioned my testosterone count, while others were thankful to hear they weren't alone in being suspicious of the tenets of masculinity. The article framed my father figures as the last of a dying breed of men who unnecessarily punished themselves and the world around them, and these men who reached out looked at the prior generation with a puzzlement similar to my own. When women wrote, they told me their own stories about their fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons, and how they were enigmas to them, men who wouldn't communicate their feelings, their insecurities, their problems. Some said they'd been considering divorcing their husbands, and some talked about the stress of raising a new generation to be better than the ones before. But some of the women weren't as supportive. One wrote that I should be ashamed of myself. According to her, the piece was another in a long line of liberal attempts to emasculate America. In her last sentence, she asked, "Whatever happened to men being men?" What she was referring to was the arbitrary gender binary by which most Americans understand the world. To that reader, and many like her, there are men and there are women, and they are to behave according to their expected roles. This is as simplistic and as self-evident as the skies being blue and gravity's holding our feet to the ground. But gender is a social construct, a result of cultural influence and pressures that have developed over time into an assumed dichotomy. And it is because of those pressures exerted by society that we see gender roles as concrete as opposed to subjective states of being. To understand this concept, one must first know from where modern traditional American masculinity originated, more specifically, white cisgender masculinity, which this book will focus on because the patriarchy that has controlled our culture has been defined and enforced by this group and includes tenets of societal privilege and white supremacy, and what necessitated both its origin and how it was adopted en masse as the status quo. Likewise, in modern times, it must be examined how these roles have been challenged by each successive generation, a reality that has led to what some have called the crisis of masculinity, a period of uncertainty and much consternation as to just what it means to be a man in America. Often it is said that winners write history. And if that is true, and it most assuredly is, then my people have contributed very little to the canon. I am descended from a long line of peoples who have failed to overcome the terrible gravity of poverty. Once upon a time, my grandma Burke, my mother's mom, had retired and looking for something to fill her time, decided to spend a summer researching our family's genealogy after a television ad for an early ancestry service piqued her interest. Grandma was an easy mark for TV products. A fervent devotee of Ron Popeil, the inventor and infomercial spokesperson for products like the Ronco food dehydrator and the Showtime rotisserie, Grandma would buy in big and spend the days waiting for its delivery, fantasizing about how it would revolutionize her life. The dehydrator didn't live up to her expectations, and, unsurprisingly, neither did the ancestry service. Where Grandma had expected to find direct links to legendary figures like George Washington or Davy Crockett, according to familial lore, both were distant relatives. What she found was a family tree stocked with scofflaws, debtors, drunkards, and out-and-out criminals. The experiment stopped abruptly after she found a succession of relatives who'd either been hung for horse thievery or killed in senseless barroom altercations. Despite the promise of the American dream and an assurance that anybody can overcome their station in life, this country contains a lot of families like mine that never managed to escape the cycle of their predecessors' poverty. They are descended from men who worked in the factories and mines of yesteryear before they were closed and shuttered and replaced by jobs behind a fast food counter and government assistance. They are beleaguered and depressed, worn out and pissed off. They've watched generations of their families work hard and never get any more reward than dying at an early age from exhaustion, with bodies broken by labor. The American dream that spurred them on has its roots in both the founding of this country and its underlying principles. The United States is a nation of immigrants who fled their native lands in hopes of staking out better futures. It is a relatively new country whose revolution was fought on the idea of personal freedom and the rights of humans to seek their destinies. Embedded in that ideal is the seed of permanent revolution, the concept of an ongoing experiment that continually reinvents itself and is thus boundless. The promise of the new country, as well as its capitalistic underpinnings and the draw of manifest destiny, meant that the American dream was achievable, but that those who hadn't experienced its bounty yet might be just one idea or one day away from striking it rich. This gave hope to my ancestors and others like them. They worked hard or else hustled hard, and they immigrated from Europe to the colonies and then Indiana and beyond. They drove forward, these frontiersmen, and settled the American West in search of their fortunes until they hit the Pacific Ocean and found themselves still wanting. With the American landscape tamed, and the country now spanning from sea to shining sea, the market represented a new horizon. With the Industrial Revolution and a shift from agrarian culture to mechanization, the promise of self-made fortune was realized by giants like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and men like them who built the country as we know it, and, in doing so, employed generations of men who worked in miserable conditions for subpar pay. American masculinity and patriarchal society have roots that go back well past this time period. In fact, white American men have enjoyed privileges since before there was an America. And those privileges resulted in the overthrow of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, mistreatment of minorities, the controlled subservience of women, and an order of hegemonic power that has existed well into the 21st century. It has defined the struggle of America since its conception. But the masculinity we are most familiar with, that of the laborer and the breadwinner, grew into being following the Civil War. An apocalyptic battle that left hundreds of thousands dead and began the transformation of the United States from an agrarian society to an industrialized one. The surrendering of the Confederacy found the slaves freed and the financial order of the country upended, meaning the hegemonic patriarchy had been dealt a slow bleeding wound that would prove fatal generations later. In the wake of this sea change, our modern definition of masculinity was forged, a definition that has lasted for roughly 150 years and is now being left behind. The men who would comprise my family and countless others were laborers who toiled in workplaces devoid of joy and rampant with safety hazards. Before the advent of unions and labor rights movements, these were jobs where men were overworked, underpaid, and maimed regularly. It was hellish, and in order to go to work every day, the laborer had to adapt both himself and his expectations to survive his harsh reality. Faced with a job that paid just enough to keep a family afloat, and sometimes not even that, the American man adapted his idea of self-worth to depend on his identity as a laborer as opposed to his fulfillment of the American dream. Calloused hands and tired bones became indicators of self-worth and proof of an attempt, however futile, to do the necessary work to survive, if not advance. What made this exchange possible was the laborer's status as a white male, a privileged position that, regardless of station or worth, prioritized him above women, minorities, homosexuals, and immigrants. He may have failed to advance or conquer the world as the gods of industry had, but society was in his favor, and at home, he was still king. American economic expansion supported a generation of families who barely survived until the market crash of 1929 plunged the country into the Great Depression, a horrific event where families like mine struggled just to eat. My grandparents' childhoods were things of nightmares, and like anyone's who's lived through the Depression, their stories are a stark reminder of the fragility of society. My great-grandparents were miners, limestone workers, handymen. When the bottom fell out, they found themselves the patriarchs of families that were homeless, starving, and beyond desperate. Often called the greatest generation, my grandparents belonged to an era dominated by a sense of duty where, on the heels of a depression, survival was the only goal. When World War II broke out, young men like my grandpa willingly joined the army and fought in the European theater. Like many women, my grandma filled the absence of men who had left the factory floor for the battlefield and pitched in making war materials. They focused on a single...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?